Parshas Chukas-Balak. In Parshas Balak, Perek Chav Gimel Pasuk Aleph, that's 23:1, the Torah describes one of the several bits of dialogue between Balak and Bilam. Balak is the king of Moab, and Bilam is his designated hitman. He's, let's say, potentially an assassin, but not using the weapon of the rifle or the gun or the bow or the arrow or the sword, but rather of the mouth. And Chazal say that Bilam had a very high level of nevuah, of prophecy of Ruach HaKodesh. Something that's difficult for us to understand, how a venal person, an evil person, he's frequently referred to as Bilam HaRasha, the evil person, how he could have this level of prophecy. I remember once in Yeshiva in Har Etzion, one of the Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Yehuda, said he could not explain it, but there is an allusion to the anomaly in the Parsha, in which this Parsha also says, besides describing the powers that Bilam had, it also says, Vayiftach Hashem es piha ason, that God opened the mouth of the donkey. In other words, donkeys don't normally speak. People who are rishaim, who are evil, don't normally have a high level of divine inspiration. But in this case, Bilam did. And Bilam is in constant dialogue with some measure of tension with Balak. Balak wants to protect his people from the Jewish juggernaut, if you will, and he's afraid of the potential harm from a confrontation between Israel and Moab. So he engages Bilam to curse the Jews, to curse Bnei Israel. And Bilam has a dialogue with the Almighty and a dialogue with Balak, and what he can say, what he can't say, and he keeps repeating that he cannot say anything that Hashem doesn't want him to say. So he comes up with a plan. And his plan is to offer several offerings, animal sacrifices, in several different places. It turns out that there's a total of 42 sacrifices that he caused Balak, that he instructed Balak to bring, to offer. And in 23:1 in Chav Gimel Aleph, Vayomer Bilam el Balak, and Bilam says to Balak, B'nei li vazeh, build for me here, Sheva Mizbachos, 7 altars. V'hachen li vazeh, Shiva Porim, V'shiva Elim. And prepare for me 7 cows and 7 rams. So that's a total of 3 times that he instructed Balak to build Mizbachos, altars, and in each of them, Balak offers 2, so that's 7 times 3 times 2, which equals 42. Okay, 42 offerings. What is going on here? This is kind of an extension of the question to begin with, which is, how does Bilam have these powers? Now, Bilam is a rasha, but still he's engaging in Hashem in the most fundamental of ways, from a Jewish perspective of engaging HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Almighty, in tefillah, through korbanos, in prayer, if you will, through offerings. And he's clearly trying to find favor in God's eyes so that God will respond affirmatively to Bilam's requests. So, is he sincere? Is he sincere in offering his korbanos? Well, he's certainly sincere in that he's trying to gain favor in God's eyes, that he can do something, and he's probably sincere about harming the Jews as well. Although that's Keneged Ratzon HaBorei, that's not what Hashem wants, and Hashem tells him specifically that's not what he wants. The Gemara in many places, and the Medrash in many places, addresses this offering or the series of offerings by Balak and says something which on its face is astounding. The Gemara treats the issue about whether a person should learn Torah and perform mitzvos for ulterior motives. In other words, not simply to please God or not to please God at all, but rather for some personal benefit, whether it's to be called a scholar or it's to be well known in the community as a good person, as a righteous person, etc. And the Gemara deals with the issue in the abstract in several places about whether it's okay to perform mitzvos and to learn Torah for reasons that are not what Chazal term as lishma, for its own sake. And there are opposing views in the Gemara. Gemara Brachos says that if a person learns Torah Lishma, Shelo Lishma, for ulterior motives, not for its own sake, it would be better if he weren't created. The dominant or more popularly repeated passage in the Gemara is just the opposite. Is La'olam Yasok Adam B'Torah Mitzvah Shelo Lishma, that a person should always perform mitzvos, should learn Torah and perform mitzvos, not for their own sake. Why? Shemitoch Shelo Lishma B'Lishma, because once a person engages in these acts for ulterior motives, sincere motives will follow. So there are a number of approaches towards this. Within the yeshiva world, it's well known that Reb Chaim Volozhiner explains that if you're actually truly learning Torah, that it's impossible at some point to not be in the zone and in the flow. And even though you may have started off with ulterior motives, you will at some point during your learning get that either aha moment or the flow moment where the goodness of the Torah itself is resonating within the individual. And that creates a lishma moment or longer, in which case every attempt to learn Torah, if it is done intensely and properly, according to Reb Chaim Volozhiner, will actually end up with a person learning Lishma. The Gemaros in Nazir, Brachos, and elsewhere appear to have a different angle. So, first of all, as to this conflict between should a person learn Shelo Lishma or do Mitzvah Shelo Lishma, is it better that he weren't created? So, Tosfos says that when the Gemara observes that it would be better if he weren't created, the Gemara is saying that a person is doing these things lekanter, to be provocative, to best his friend, to defeat somebody with whom he perhaps has an argument. So he digs around in the Gemara or in the Torah, whatever part of the Torah, to come up with something that will cause him to prevail in a dispute, not because he's seeking the truth, not because he's trying to plumb the depths of the Torah, but rather because he wants to win. He's playing color war. So that, on that, says Tosfos, the Gemara says that it would be better if he were not created. Now, how about here? The Gemara says something astonishing, which is that in the merit of the 42 offerings of Balak, that Zacha v'yatzasa mimenu Rus, that he merited having Rus come from him, and Shiatza mimenu Shlomo, that Shlomo came from him. And what did Shlomo do? It says in Malachim Aleph in Kings 1, Elef alos yaleh Shlomo. Shlomo brought 1,000 offerings. So it appears that Balak is mitoch shelo lishma ba lishma. That, and that's what the Gemara cites this passage as a proof text for the concept that it's, if you do something insincerely, the sincerity will come. And the question here is, where did the sincerity come? We don't ever see that Balak, who actually appears to have built the altars at the direction of Bilam, he's doing it to harm the Jews. So first of all, how is that considered not lekanter? And secondly, where do we see that lishma, that sincerity comes from this? So as far as the first question, Rabbi Yaakov Kaminetsky says that if a person is trying to establish a relationship with God, in other words, he's not simply going through the motions, but he's trying to establish a relationship with God, even if it's to get God or to try to persuade God, solicit God's help to do something that in the end God doesn't want him to do, but there's still that step of creating a relationship, and that, says Rabbi Yaakov, is considered lishma. That's astounding. That's what Rabbi Yaakov says. Now the question is, where do we see mitoch shelo lishma ba lishma? And I was talking about this question tonight with Rabbi Yehuda Nadoff of Chicago. And he suggested that the extension of the Gemara that says that ultimately not only did Rus HaMoaviyah descend from Balak, but also David and then Shlomo, and Shlomo brought offerings. Shlomo's offerings were sincere. And what we see, according to this, is that even though Balak was not sincere, and he never became sincere in his offering of korbanos, he didn't do it to please God. He did it for his own ulterior motives. But ultimately, from him descended Shlomo HaMelech, the wisest of kings, who offered countless offerings sincerely for the sake of heaven. And so we see that a person, and it's likely that it's not just a person's descendants, but it's anybody who's influenced. If a person learns Torah, a person that performs mitzvos, as long as he's not doing it for abusive purposes. In other words, he's doing it for sincere purposes. He's learning. Excuse me. He's doing it for at least non-malevolent purposes. And admittedly, Rabbi Yaakov's distinction here may be a fine one. But if a person davens, he performs mitzvos, he learns Torah, even if his motivation for learning Torah is the iskarya rav, that he should be called a rabbi. In other words, he's doing it for greatness, but that greatness is a greatness of Torah, then others may well be influenced by his learning of the Torah, and we don't deem it to be corrupt. We do not adopt a cancel culture. On the contrary, we adopt a culture that even though we may criticize somebody for being evil, for being insincere, for being short-sighted, but if there's a redemptive act on his part, if there's an act that has redemptive value, we validate that act, and that act can, through the generations or through the permutations, have become refined in another person who may take the example of that action and turn it into a sincere activity in which that individual who's influenced ultimately becomes an Eved Hashem, a true servant of God, who serves HaKadosh Baruch Hu Emes, serves God through truth, even though he may have been inspired by somebody who wasn't inherently sincere in his learning of the Torah or performance of the mitzvos. That means that the Torah that he learns and the mitzvos that he performs, even if the person has significant shortcomings, those actions may have a ripple effect throughout the generations that is vertically and also horizontally within the generation on other people, that ultimately they end up doing mitzvos and learning Torah lishma sincerely. Have a good Shabbos.